Hello YouTube and welcome back to another video with Scruffy Tales. In this video we will explore the tactics of Gå på, the doctrine that has for 300 years allowed Swedish soldiers to defeat superior forces by advancing into close combat and kill him at point blank range. By the time the Great Northern War began, the armies of Europe had learned hard lessons from the 30 Years' War only a few decades earlier. The Swedish king, Gustav II Adolf, had taught the world the importance of combined arms warfare, so much so that he today is known as the father of modern warfare. The musket had been refined, bayonets equally so. Tactics in Europe had evolved and now focused on relying on close-order drills to guide troops on the battlefield in order to unleash devastating volleys of musket fire into enemy lines. When the Great Northern War began, fought between 1700 and 1721, Sweden knew all too well the importance of these tactics in the modern world. After all, a Swedish king had perfected them only 60 years earlier. But Sweden had one major issue: numbers. Sweden lacked the numbers to be able to effectively engage in prolonged battles, and as a consequence was unable to perform and last through long and enduring military campaigns. So, 60 years after Sweden had taught the world how to wage war properly, it was time for Sweden to yet again teach the world a lesson in warfare. And this time, the lesson was how to repeatedly, over and over again, defeat numerically superior forces. And Sweden well and truly did achieve this by pulling off one astounding victory after the other. Time and time again, the Swedish army would defeat enemies numbering 3 or 4 times their strength in manpower and cannons. And while there are dozens of battles to choose from, nothing highlights this capability better than the battle at Fraustadt, in my opinion. At Fraustadt, the Swedish troops consisted of 3,700 infantry and 5,700 cavalry, 9,400 troops in total. They faced a combined German and Russian army of 16,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, 20,000 troops all in all, as well as 32 cannons. When battle lines were drawn, the Germans and Russians prepared quick fortifications, because by now they knew that the Swedes favored the assault over a defensive posture. The Swedes faced a numerically superior enemy in a defensive position, supported by artillery. So what did the Swedes do? They charged. While the cavalry outmaneuvered the enemy on both flanks, the infantry charged into the German and Russian center, despite going up against an enemy outnumbering them 4 to 1 on foot, despite facing cannons without any artillery of their own, despite the enemy having prepared defenses. And the Swedes ran through the incoming fire, into melee, into hand-to-hand combat, and won the battle. 400 dead Swedes and around 1,000 wounded. The enemy? They lost 7,400 troops, 2,000 wounded, and around 7,500 were captured. An important note from the aftermath of this battle is that the number of prisoners would have been far more numerous had not the Swedish army executed some 6,000 Russian soldiers who had surrendered. It was a massacre, a slaughter. The Swedish army at the time was not only fierce in combat, it was also cruel in victory. So how did the Swedish army achieve such victories time and time again? Because it wasn't an isolated incident. Sweden pulled off similar victories throughout the 20 years of the Great Northern War. They even almost managed it at the famous defeat at Poltava. 25,000 Swedes suffering from malnutrition and sickness with 30 cannons almost won over a Russian force of 75,000 troops in total, who were well fed and rested, who also brought 100 Russian cannons. How could they possibly have done this? Well, it was a combination of morale, discipline, religious faith, and aggressive tactics. The Swedish soldier was known as a Carolean, so named after the Swedish kings who began this reform of the Swedish army. Karl X, Karl XI, and Karl XII. Karl XII is perhaps better known internationally as Charles XII or Carolus Rex. The first important change was how the Swedish army recruited its soldiers. Instead of picking a random man of fighting age from a village, each village had its assigned soldier. It was his job. The village provided him with food and shelter and helped him maintain his equipment. He was a professional soldier who trained regularly to be a soldier. Already here, the Swedish army had gained the upper hand against many of its enemies. Another important aspect was religion. The Caroleans, Karolinerna as they are called in Swedish, were devout Christians. They believed that what they were doing was the will of God, and whatever happened on the battlefield was equally the will of God. Live or die was not up to you or any general. It was God's choice. This meant that the Caroleans did not fear going into battle, because God was with them and God would take care of them. So the Caroleans combined professional training with strict discipline and fanatical faith. But how was this exploited on the battlefield? How did they fight? Well, they sort of charged straight at the enemy. During the 30-Year War, Sweden proved to the world that if you had enough firepower and troops that were maneuverable, you could win over what appeared to be a more powerful enemy. Get as many muskets firing as possible, relocate troops, relocate cannons. If you maneuver and outgun the enemy, you will win, even with inferior numbers. By the time of the Great Northern War, everyone had learned these lessons, so Sweden had no way of outgunning anyone. Sweden still struggled with the problem that the army had too few soldiers to last in a prolonged fight. During the 30 Years' War, the solution was to gun down the enemy at range with powerful volleys. During the Great Northern War, the solution would turn out to be almost the exact opposite. If you are outnumbered 4-1 and both armies are at 100 meters shooting at each other, you quickly realize that the larger army will inflict more damage, will be able to outmaneuver you, and inflict even more damage. And the little damage you inflict in turn is not enough to win the battle. Engaging in a shootout was therefore the last thing that the Caroleans wanted. They knew they couldn't last a campaign relying on these modern tactics, because even if they won a battle or two, by the third and fourth battle they would have suffered so many losses to incoming fire that they could no longer continue the fight. Something new was required. The solution was to exploit the fact that muskets were slow to reload and had poor accuracy at longer ranges. This meant that you could with relative safety advance upon the enemy and close the distance with few casualties during the first and second enemy volley of fire. The Caroleans would march through these first initial volleys and then fire their own first volley at around 50 meters. At 50 meters, a musket is very accurate. You will hit what you aim at without any trouble. And with the size of the musket ball being fired, when you hit, heads will explode, arms will be torn off, and torsos will be blown wide open. When the Caroleans opened fire, Their small numbers allowed them to focus their firepower on a narrow section of the enemy line at a distance that guaranteed effect on target, terrifying and horrible effect. They would then advance to 20 meters and there fire their second volley. Remember, the enemy are at this point trying to help their wounded. The officers are trying to get their troops into position, soldiers are trying to reload. And now the Caroleans fire their second volley at 20 meters with hundreds of muskets, firing point blank into the enemy lines. The havoc must have been a nightmare conjured in the depths of hell itself. And as the enemy tried to make sense of the chaos, surrounded by ripped apart bodies, blood splattered everywhere, men screaming out of pain and fear, a roar would rise above the sounds of despair and gunpowder, a roar as the Caroleans, with pike, rapier, and bayonet, now charged into melee, into hand-to-hand combat, into the gap they had created in the enemy line with their devastating volleys fired at close range. And the armies they faced, who by now were focused on fighting the enemy at range with muskets and cannons, found themselves fighting Swedish soldiers who had focused their training on the use of the rapier and the bayonet in the deadly and chaotic realm of the melee. This was the tactic of gå på, go on. You marched through the enemy fire, ignoring the incoming hail of musket balls, until you fired your own weapons only once you saw the white in the enemy's eyes. And then you charged into the enemy line and killed him in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Gå på allowed the Swedish army, the Caroleans, to time and time again defeat numerically superior enemies. The Caroleans were professional soldiers, religious fanatics, and skilled warriors. And by moving in close with the enemy and killing him at point-blank range, enemies that were vastly numerically superior lost battle after battle against these elite soldiers of Sweden, the Caroleans. The Caroleans' glory days ended 300 years ago, almost to the year, which might make you think that the tactics of gå på are a thing of the past, something you read about in history books detailing legendary soldiers of a long-lost empire. You might be surprised to learn that gå på never truly went away. Closing with the enemy and fighting in his own lines has for 300 years been part of the Swedish doctrine. During the Winter War of World War II, a company of Swedish Jaegers found themselves outnumbered and outflanked on three sides by a Soviet battalion. Eventually, the Swedes found themselves low on ammunition. Not only that, they could see that the Soviets were assembling troops to advance on the Swedish positions. The Swedes' response was to fix bayonets and assault the Soviet center. With hardly any ammunition left, they charged the Soviets, relying on hand grenades and bayonets to take the fight to the numerically superior enemy. The fierce and furious assault forced the Soviets to retreat, and when it was all over, the Swedish Jaegers had lost 9 soldiers, and close to 200 Soviets were found dead in the snow. In the 60s, during the Congo crisis, Swedish UN soldiers found themselves ambushed while escorting a supply train. A Swedish major, Erik Bonde, was shot twice during the ambush and while wounded gave the order to assault the enemy positions. Taking the lead himself, Major Bonde, while wounded, ran towards the enemy, followed by the Swedish soldiers firing their Swedish K submachine guns, and forced the enemy to retreat and abandon the fight altogether. Afterwards, a now classic picture was taken of Major Bonde, shirtless and with 2 bullet wounds, smoking a cigarette while wearing sunglasses. And this idea of assaulting an enemy position and conduct combat in the enemy line rather than at a distance was nowhere better demonstrated in the modern army than with the Swedish armored infantry. The armored infantry was supposed to assault head-on enemy positions with armored vehicles and tanks, and only dismount once in the enemy line, or keep fighting from the vehicle's hatches. The armored infantry was and still are the heavy shock troops of the Swedish army. Supported by mortars and tanks, they are supposed to charge the enemy positions and hit it in full force with armored vehicles and infantry. You could say that the armored infantry are the knights of the modern age, relying on armored steeds to bring armored soldiers into the enemy formation and with the power of momentum force the enemy to break apart and retreat. The most dangerous thing I did as a conscript was doing a live fire exercise through woods so thick you could only see the guys directly to your left and right, at times not even that far. Advancing through that type of terrain with live ammunition was scary as hell, because you could hear bullets snapping branches and hitting trees all around you. At times, tracers from machine guns entered your field of vision, having bounced off rocks. And we did this at platoon level. Our captain told us that not even the US Marines conducted such live fire exercises. If that is true or not, I don't know. All I can do is tell you what he told us. Needless to say, it was very dangerous, but our officers were confident we could handle it, that they had trained us well enough, and we did handle it. They had trained us very well. But each time was scary as hell. And training to use the bayonet was also pretty intense, as all strikes were aimed at an opponent's head and face. And I remember very clearly when our instructor explained to us that grabbing the rifle as a club and swinging like a madman at an opponent's head, obviously, was just as effective as it was brutal. This is what the modern Swedish army calls gå på marsch. Gå på is basically an order that is given when the fighting is so chaotic that a platoon leader or squad leader cannot possibly provide orders quick enough or be in control of the situation, when individual soldiers have to react to what is happening 2, 3, 5 meters ahead of them. The order of gå på is given when the only way forward is going through the enemy at point blank range. To give an example, a platoon leader or squad leader can give the order eldstöt, which means everyone dumps multiple rounds at the enemy in order to suppress him. On the command framåt, everyone moves forward. And this is repeated until you are close to the enemy. This is not traditional bounding. This demands a lot of ammo, since each eldstöt involves so many rounds being fired. It is also much faster than traditional bounding, since you are not waiting for another fire team to move or set up fire positions. The entire squad moves as one as quickly as possible. When you get close enough to the enemy position, maybe trenches, maybe a tree line or a ridge, the command can be given gå på marsch. The order to gå på is preferably preceded by how far you're supposed to move, and then you give the order framåt, forward. On the command of forward, gå på is in effect, which means the squad leader no longer is in control. Each pair of battle buddies do their own thing. They engage the enemy as they see fit, they advance as best they can, and continue the fight by any means at their disposal, free to hunt down the enemy. But the key is maintaining fire on the enemy and moving at speed towards the enemy and taking ground up to and into the enemy position, and there kill the enemy at point blank range by any means possible or available. Gå på is, when you think about it, a quite natural step for mission command. Mission command means you trust the leader closest to the action to make the correct decision. And in chaotic combat or in dense woods with little visibility, When a squad leader has no chance of maintaining control of his unit, then the next natural step for mission command is to trust the individual soldier to make the correct decision, being closest to the action directly in front of him. Eldstöt and gå på could be used if you're on a patrol and find yourself in an ambush. Instead of peeling out of the kill zone, you have the option to dump ammo on the enemy and suppress him with eldstöt, and then with gå på, take the fight to the enemy and push into his positions and kill him. You could dismount from your vehicles after having charged into the enemy lines, and as soon as you step outside, the squad leader could give the order of gå på marsch in order to take control of a ridge line that the enemy is firing from. It gives the Swedish soldiers the ability to quickly react to an enemy presence and to, through quick action, overrun an enemy location. From the Caroleans of the Great Northern War, to the Jaegers of World War II, to the armored infantry of the Cold War, to our modern day and age, gå på marsch has been a central part of Swedish army doctrine. Move at speed upon the enemy and kill him in close combat. A tactic that has been battle-proven for 300 years. A tactic that makes the Swedish army a deadly fighting force on the modern battlefield. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Have a nice day.